hello, good morning everybody. Before we get into talking about why we're here, we're just going to do a quick activity. So can you all please stand up and pair with somebody? This will take 2 minutes. So pick a partner, anybody at all in the room. Okay. And we're going to have a 2-minute conversation about your shoes. Okay, so I want you to talk to about 1 minute each. I'll give you a warning in about a minute, but a 2-minute conversation about your shoes starting now. Okay, so you probably thought sitting back there you'd be safe, but I can move around. We can come down here. So let me hear something that you learned about the other person that has nothing to do with their shoes. Yeah.
He's from Minnesota, likes to go camping a lot with his family, and they drive around the whole state in a camper. And
cool.
That's one of the things I like.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Somebody else? One more. You learned their name? Sure. Yeah. So welcome, Almo.
Thanks.
Okay.
Learned the name and found out that she is keen on walking around, and she's explored Facebook already using her shoes.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. One more thing.
Found out it's from Norway, from the southwest in a town I can't remember the name of.
Okay. But from Norway, what is the town?
It's Stavanger.
Okay. Okay. Well, welcome. Okay. So notice that even in a very short exchange about shoes, we can learn a lot about the other person that has nothing at all to do with shoes, or that extends from our initial inquiry about shoes. Okay. So part of the point here is, and we'll build on this throughout the next 90 minutes or so, there's a lot of hidden knowledge in the exchanges, even the very brief exchanges that we have with each other, and we can learn a lot about our architecture and its context as well by applying that same principles. That's something that we'll build on over the next while. Okay? So you can all sit down again. Thank you.
It was never bad on following directions.
Great. All right. Okay. So premise for today is that we're here because we want to make sense of our system architectures, our product architectures, in order to take appropriate action. And part of the premise, at least for me, is that we're operating in conditions of complexity and uncertainty and volatility and ambiguity, conditions under which it's important to have some additional tools to help us make sense of our architectures. Is that fair enough? Okay. And as an additional forewarning, we will be interacting a lot throughout the next hour and a half. It is a workshop. We will be talking with each other. You will be doing some activities over the next while and be engaging with each other and with me. Is that okay? Okay. Okay. Okay, so a number of parts to this. Part one, let's talk about some ways that we will make sense of our system architectures. So in the brief example there about shoes, it's sort of a related example to what I often refer to as the water cooler conversations we have around the office or about our projects. So think about those things that you might discuss with your colleagues or your friends when you meet over lunch or when you meet at the water cooler. Sometimes things come up about the architecture or about the project or the product or the organization that don't always make their way into the formal sort of project reports or architecture reviews. Does that make sense? So it would be useful if we had a way to capture some of those things. So we'll be building on that idea of how do we capture some of those sort of water cooler conversation moments and use those to help us make sense of our architectures. Okay, so next activity. I've got a bunch of these pages here. I'm going to ask you to just pass them out, but I'm going to be asking you to sketch very briefly. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but very briefly to sketch your architecture. So if you're working with multiple systems, that's fine, just pick one. If you haven't worked on one recently, that's fine, just pick a recent one that you've worked on. But pick an architecture that you're working with or have worked with recently and just draw a brief sketch of that architecture. So we're going to hold those for just a moment because we're going to build up a series of artifacts very quickly to help us as collateral when we start to make sense of our architecture. So that's one. That sketch of our architecture is the first one. The second thing I'm going to ask you to do is very quickly think of a metaphor you use, or a metaphor you would use for that architecture that you just sketched. Okay? So on the hexagons that I left on your tables there, whether you want to use words or pictures or a combination or any other form to represent the metaphor, think about a metaphor that represents the architecture that you just sketched and describe it on one of these stickies. You all should have one, but if you don't, please just raise your hand. And we'll give this 3 minutes. Okay. So again, wherever you are is just fine with that. We'll be revisiting all of these shortly. So there's one more activity that I'm going to move to in just a second. We just want to draw your attention to some green stickies that I left on your table. So there's a bunch of these for everybody. So just little green circles. So please put your initials or some identifying mark on these, something that you'll recognize later as you do this. So for now, take 2 of these circles and put one on the yellow poster with your architecture sketch and put one on the hexie with your metaphor. And for each activity we do, I'll ask you to use 1 or more of those. Okay, so the next activity then. So just like we did with the shoes earlier, there's a lot of hidden meaning sometimes in the discussions that we have, or a lot of things that emerge from the discussions that we have. What I want you to do is thinking about the architecture that you just sketched and the metaphor that you used to describe that architecture or to reference that architecture. Think about a decision related to your architecture that either really frustrated you or really delighted you, something that's not in between, something that's at one extreme or the other. You know, it either was a really delightful decision or a really frustrating decision. Okay, does that resonate with people? Have you got something you can call to mind? Okay. Now, think about a context where you've got a friend that's thinking about joining your team. It's a friend that's going to be working with this architecture if they join your team. What will you tell your friend? So I'm going to ask you to think about that for just a second, and then I'll pass out some more stickies and ask you to write something. But think about the decision that really frustrated you or that really delighted you, and think about what will you tell your friend. So you're going to meet this friend for lunch or for dinner. You're going to be talking about the prospect of joining your team. What is it that you're going to tell your friend? And again, remember, this is somebody that you trust, that you care about, whose well-being is important to you. And then think about, well, what if this story that you tell your friend appeared on Twitter or in a newspaper feed? What would be a good headline for this story? So the activity is this. On a sticky note, which I'll pass out in just a second, write down what you're going to tell your friend and give it a memorable title. So up top here, you'll give it a title, and here you'll just write some text of the story that you'll tell your friend. It doesn't have to be word for word, but the outline of a story that you'll tell your friend about that decision. Does that make sense? Okay. So think about that for a moment, and I'm going to pass out these hexies. Okay, so again, wherever you are is just fine with that. So you've got 3 artifacts now at this point. You've got the sketch of your architecture, you've got a metaphor that relates to your architecture, and you've got a story that you would relate to your friend about an architecture decision. Okay? So please make sure that you've got your green sticker on each one of those. But let's hear a couple of examples. We won't go around to everybody just yet, but just 1 or 2 examples of metaphors that you used to describe your architecture. Yeah?
Mine is eventual consistency, or the tale of always chasing the event queue and hoping it processes fast enough.
Thank you. Yeah?
Mine was a clock.
A clock. Okay, thank you.
Hunting dog.
Hunting dog. Okay, thank you. Yep.
CPU L1, L2 cache.
CPU L1, L2 cache. Okay, so one thing to notice about those metaphors is they make sense to you in your context, but they may not make sense to everybody in the room. Is that fair? Yeah. And that doesn't mean they're not important. It means they've got some, it means they're loaded with meaning and context because of your place and your knowledge and your insight into the architecture. So we'll take a step back for a moment. And I just want to refer briefly to the SATURN interaction model. And anybody come across this before? Different contexts, yeah. So Jerry Weinberg wrote a lot about this. So SATURN interaction model basically describes how our human processing systems have 4 parts: intake, meaning, significance, and response. So we take in information, we apply meaning to it, we decide how significant that meaning is or how significant the information is once we attach meaning to it, and then we decide on an appropriate response. Glenda Yang has a similar model, the adaptive action cycle, that distills it down to 3 basic questions. What is this that I'm looking at? So what? Why is this important? Why is it significant? Now what? Now what am I going to do? What's the action I'm going to take in response to this information? And that's a lot of what we'll be building on over the next 60 minutes or so. So the first 30 minutes or so, we've been generating some information about our architectures. We've been intaking some information, generating some stories related to stuff we might tell our friends about decisions in our architecture, some metaphors about our architecture, some sketches. And in a few minutes, we're going to start making sense of all of that. We're going to start to attach some meaning to it. And the ultimate goal is to help us decide what action to take, because it's not always clear what action we should take in a complex system. But the process that we'll go through will give us some insight into some of that. One thing to note about communication: what I send is not always what you receive. What you send is not always what I receive. It's just the nature of human communication. We apply our own filters, our own biases, our own experiences to the information that the other party sends to us. So we'll miss bits, we'll chop bits off, we'll add bits on that were never intended. But the sum total of what we receive is rarely what the other person intended to send. Surprise anybody? Yeah, okay, great. So given that level of ambiguity in communication, how do we accommodate for that in trying to make sense of our system architectures, especially when we might be dealing with very large architectures and very large and diverse groups of people? So we're going to go through an exercise in a few minutes, but first I want to explain some of the artifacts of that exercise, because some of this might be unfamiliar, which is fine. But you're going to answer a series of questions based on the architecture you sketched and the metaphor you used to describe that architecture, and based on the experience that you related to your friend. Okay, so those 3 things that we just did, you're going to answer a series of questions based on those 3 things. But the format of the questions will be a little unusual. Okay, so some of the questions will be framed as triangles. Okay, so I'm not asking you to make a yes/no decision or a binary decision in this case. I'm asking you to trade off between 3 variables. So quick show of hands if you had coffee or tea in the morning break or for breakfast. Okay, so most people. Okay, great. So think about in the cup, and I see many of you still have coffee cups in front of you, but in the coffee cup that you have, or the tea cup, think about the balance of tea or coffee in the cup, of milk or cream, or of sugar. Okay, so you're going to take one of your green dots and you're going to go, this won't be one of the triangles, but I'll talk about the actual ones in a moment. But if this were one of the questions you were answering, you would take one of your green dots, and if the cup that you've got is just 100% coffee, no milk or sugar, you would put your green dot up here. Okay, does that make sense? If the cup was for some reason all sugar, you'd put your sticker down here, so nothing else in the cup. Or if it was all milk or cream, you'd put your sticker down here. If it was 33% coffee, 33% milk, 33% sugar, you'd put your sticker right in the middle. So in other words, equal proportions of each. Or if it was mostly coffee with a little sugar, little milk, you'd put your sticker up here. Does that make sense? So what I'm not asking you is how much sugar did you have, how much coffee did you have, how much milk did you have. I'm asking you to show me the balance of all 3 in your cup. Okay, is that fair enough? So it's not 3 questions, it's 1 question that's trading off between 3 attributes. Okay, so think about the last meal that you had, or the meal that you might have for lunch today. what will be the balance on your plate between meat, vegetables, and spices. If you're a vegetarian or vegan, you're probably going to be down here with no meat and all vegetables and spices. You might have some balance of vegetables, spices, and meat on your plate. If it's 100% meat, you'd be up here. If it's 100% vegetables, you'd be down here. If it's somewhere in the middle, you're showing me the balance of those different elements on your plate. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Think about your response to the last newspaper headline you read or recent world events. You pick one that's relevant for you. Think about how you feel when you read that newspaper headline or see that story unfold in the press. What's your balance of concern, empathy, and anger? So our reactions to these things are rarely simple and binary. It's not just that I either feel anger or empathy or concern. It's maybe some mix of those three. Think about your architecture. What's important in your architecture? When you have to make trade-offs, do you trade off between what's the trade-off you make between performance, scalability, and security? So in this example here, we're saying that security is very important, but so is scalability. Performance, we're willing to trade off performance to get appropriate degrees of security and scalability. Does that make sense? Okay. We swap out security for monitoring and logging. We can see how that affects our balance. So in that case, performance and scalability are the most important factors. We're sacrificing some monitoring and logging to get appropriate performance and scalability. The second type of question that you'll see, we call it a dyad or a continuum, and that's more straightforward. It's just asking you to pick a point somewhere on a continuum and put your answer there. So in this experience, deployment of the product or feature is either fully manual or fully automated, or somewhere in between. If it's mostly manual with a little bit of automation, you're over here somewhere. If it's mostly automated with a little bit of manual processes, you're over here somewhere. If it was 100% automated, you'd be on the far side over on the far right as you're looking at it. And then there's some questions that are a quadrant, and they're just asking, apologies for the resolution, they're asking you to place a sticker trading off between two variables. In these cases, it's either helpful and unhelpful versus too little or too much. You'll see the questions when you get there. But you're placing a dot in the quadrant. And then there are some multiple choice questions that you'll see. They'll be pretty straightforward, like this one is asking you, what, if anything, made the situation more difficult? You can select one or more of those, 0 or more, in fact, of those. For other questions, it'll be one answer out of 5. You'll be picking one, like how common is this type of experience? So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to take your collection of stickers and go around to each of the posters and answer each of the questions. So everybody should answer all of the questions. We'll organize how we approach this in just a second, because I'm just conscious of everything being on this side of the room. But I'll give you a time box within which to answer the questions. It'll be probably 7 minutes. We'll see if you need more time after the 7 minutes, but 7 minutes is usually plenty. I don't want you to overthink the questions. Just go with your first gut reaction. But remember that you're answering the questions based on the experience that you're telling your friend, based on the metaphor you're using to refer to your architecture, and based on the architecture that you sketched in the first part of the activity. Okay? So what questions do you have before we begin? Yeah, please.
For your scale, you have it vertically, like following a plan and inspired to change?
Yes.
So if it's 100% following a plan,
You would be right here on the right-hand side. Yeah. And apologies for we're working with tape to keep those up, but yeah, you'd be right over here if it was 100%. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Answering the question is doing exactly what?
Taking one of your green dots and placing it somewhere on the poster.
Okay, and I have to write my initials.
Yes, please. Yeah. So maybe let's take 1 minute now to write your initials on a whole bunch of those green stickers, and I'll explain why that's important after we do the exercise. So let's take 1 minute to write your initials on the green dots if you haven't already, and then I'll start the countdown for the activity itself. Okay, great. So a lot of people have already put their initials on the stickers. Please just go for it and start the activity. I'll start the timer. So we've got 7 minutes starting now. Okay, so we'll give you just a moment to finish up. Please take your time with it. In the meantime, what I'll do is I'll just move on to the next part with everybody else. So by answering the questions, we'll go through the patterns in a moment, but by answering the questions, you got a sense for the type of questions that I asked, okay? And I intentionally chose those questions. You didn't have any input into those questions, but those questions relate somehow to the architecture that you described. What I want to do just very briefly is illustrate how we can extend this very easily and very quickly to consider other topics of interest, okay? So think for a moment about something related to your architecture that you're curious about, that you want to know more about, that you're interested in, but that didn't get addressed through the questions that you just answered. What I want to do is add another question for you, a question that I get from you that we're going to use to understand something about your architecture that's not coming through from these questions. Okay, so think about a topic, and just I can only go with one, but give me some suggestions.
Looking back, how much do you think you'd change? A lot versus a little?
Yeah, so how much do you think you'd change a lot versus a little? Okay, we happy with that? Yes, no, yeah, great. Okay, so we'll go with that one. Is there a spare one of these anywhere? Yeah, I think I saw some. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Great, thank you. So that question fits very nicely with the DYAD type. So it's you know, you can imagine it as a continuum. You know, in hindsight, how much would you change? A lot versus a little, or you know, what I'll do is I'll describe it as everything versus nothing, because generally when we're designing these DYAD questions, we want them to be two extremes. Is that okay? Okay. So think about a second question then that we can use with one of the triangles. So something that might have three attributes that we're trading off against.
Maybe why were the decisions chosen and money, cost, and time? Money, quality, and time.
Money, quality, and time. Okay. So money, quality, time. So I'm thinking about that one. So what influenced your decision? Money, quality, time. You good with that? Where did the question come from? Over here. Yeah, sorry. So what influenced your decision? Money, quality, time. Yeah. All right. What I'll do is I'll expand the question to something like, what influenced decisions in this experience? And we said money, quality, and time. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I'm going to ask you two to help me for just a moment then, since you had the questions. Could you please find a suitable space for those? Yeah, we've got some tape here. Okay, so for everybody else, I'm going to ask you to stand again and answer these two questions. So that breaks pretty easily. Oops, sorry. Okay, so two new questions that we didn't have a moment ago. In the same way that you did for the other questions, answer them in relation to your experience with your architecture. Okay, so remember, we're moving towards deciding what action to take in relation to our architecture. to get there, we've been generating some information that helps us make sense of our experiences with our architecture. When you look around the room, what do you notice on the posters? Some similarities, certainly, and more generally, there's some patterns that have emerged on the various posters. So you can see, even though you probably can't read the detail from way back there, you can visually see there's clusters of green dots in certain parts, there's blank spaces in others. So some patterns have emerged, right? So we're going to analyze these together. And for the next probably 20, 25 minutes or so, you're going to be standing a lot. So think about that for a moment, because that can be hard on the feet this early in the day and everything. So if you need to look after yourself, please do grab a chair. But I'm going to invite you to come gather around the posters, and we'll walk through them together, and we'll analyze the patterns that have emerged. No, we don't need to look at the slides at all. In fact, there we go. Okay, so just come close enough that you can at least distinguish patterns in the dots, and I'll call out what's on the various posters. So there's no particular starting point that's any more important than the others. What we're doing here is spending a little bit of time looking at some patterns related to our architecture and our context and our environment. Now, if we were all 25 people, part of a single team, single company working on the same product, obviously these would all relate to that product. Let's pretend we are for the purpose of the activity. Even though we're not, I suspect we'll still see some useful and interesting patterns. But imagine that you're doing this with your team of 25 or so people, and that these patterns relate to that. So I'm going to start just here with this one. It's the first triangle nearest to me. So this is the role of the architect in this experience is. And what do you notice as you look at those patterns? Bottom left corner is empty, yep. So the subject matter expert corner is empty, meaning that we don't have any cases in the experiences that we've described where the architect was playing just the role of subject matter expert. Okay? There may be some cases where they were balancing the role of subject matter expert with being a coach or mentor, or balancing it with being a programmer developer, but they were not just playing the role of subject matter expert. Okay, what else? There's a lot of hybrid, yeah. So this cluster in the middle here, yeah, absolutely. So we've got a lot of cases where the architect is balancing all three. So none of this is about good or bad or right or wrong. It's just about trying to get a picture of what is in relation to our architecture. And we may decide that that's a good thing. We want our architects to be playing a hybrid role of all three, and maybe even some other things as well. Or we may decide that for a given set of architects, we want them to be playing more of a role of coach and mentor and subject matter expert, and not doing so much day-to-day programming. That's a decision that's separate from this. This is just information. Okay, so again, not good or bad, just is. Okay. Let's take a look at this one. In this experience, architecture responsibility is what? Self-contained in one team, shared across many teams, or has external dependencies. And what patterns are we seeing here?
Self-contained.
Yeah, a lot of self-contained, yeah.
Not a lot of balance.
Not a lot of balance between all three. There's one right there in the center, yeah, but overall not a lot of balance across all three. No cases where it's just external dependencies, which is probably a good thing. Yeah, that means we at least have some degree of control over our architecture. There's a couple of cases here where it's maybe getting close to having a lot of external dependencies. Okay, but overall, yeah, a lot of self-containment there with some external dependencies maybe. Okay, let's take a look at this one. What was impacted in the experience you shared? Design quality, customer value, user experience. This is the first of the ones we've looked at where we've got a couple of not applicable. Okay, so that's interesting, if nothing else. Okay, so we could look at why those are not applicable. Yeah, so there's none that are dominated by customer value is how I would phrase it. Yeah, exactly. We've got a cluster in the middle here that seem to be a balance of all three. We've got some that are heavily influenced by customer value, but some design quality, some user experience. We've got one that's dominated by user experience, one that's dominated by design quality. Okay. So sometimes what you'll see is a heavy dominance to this side of the triangle, maybe influenced heavily by design quality and user experience, but not so much by customer value. That would be a concern. It's not so much a concern in this case. Yeah.
So in this situation, it seems kind of impossible, but it could be wrong though, to try to focus on all three at the same time. So is there ever a point that you would say you can never place it in the middle, or is this more like whatever you feel like anyone can like?
Yeah, so I'll just replay the question just to make sure I'm capturing it, and then so people at the back hear it. So correct me if I get this wrong, but I think you're saying getting a real balance, an exact balance between all three might be impossible. So in those cases, do people who are responding to the question as you just did place it where you feel is the right answer, or do you use this information to?
Like essentially, would you ahead of time tell them this is an impossible scenario?
Oh, no. No. So the question then is, ahead of time, would I tell people it's impossible to achieve an exact balance? This is an impossible scenario. Don't place your sticker in the middle. No, absolutely not. No, I would never influence the answer in that way. So there is no right answer or wrong answer. The answer is whatever is correct to you. And just like with the shoes at the very beginning, just like with the metaphor or the story that you would tell your friend over lunch, these experiences are personal to you. So it doesn't matter if I disagree. That's a different question. But the placement of the dot is what's correct for you. So even if we're looking at the same architecture at the same time, you might place a dot right there, and I might place a dot right there. Neither of us are wrong. It's just we've got different information and different perceptions. Okay. So let's take a look at this one. Maintainability. What was affected for better or worse? Maintainability, extensibility, stability. What do you see there?
There's a balance of everything.
Yeah, mostly it's a balance. Yeah. Couple of things where extensibility is starting to dominate, but overall we've got a reasonable balance between all three. Okay. What was an important driver in the experience that you shared between cost, revenue, and features or content? What are we seeing here?
Revenue is neglected.
Yeah, revenue is neglected.
The other interesting thing is cost was the primary driver.
Yeah.
Most everything.
Yeah. So this is not an untypical picture. So I see this quite a lot where revenue is neglected. It's not that it's not important in the big picture, of course it is. But generally, when we're making architecture decisions, we don't always make those decisions with the view to how the decision we're making impacts the revenue of the organization, that sort of stuff. And one of my arguments is we should be more conscious of those sorts of things. But again, it's not about right or wrong. It's just, is it helpful? And we've got to look at other outcomes to determine that. Okay, anything else on this one?
Heavy clustering the features.
Yeah.
Even versus cost.
Yeah, very heavy clustering.
For the features to get them.
Yeah. So how does that resonate with your experience in your organizations? Is features and content usually the dominant driver? I know it is for the teams.
Money at the problem, so cost of,
Yeah.
if we make the customer happy, throw money at the problem versus,
Yeah.
oh, I'm worried about cost, don't deliver that solution.
Right. Yeah.
In my experience, until it starts costing too much.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right, as you're starting.
Yeah.
For now, cost is not an issue. I'll let you know when it becomes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll make it cost less.
Yeah. Yeah, but that, as I said, that is a very typical pattern that I see, that those are the dominant drivers. Okay, and let's see, is this the new triangle that we added? It is, yeah. So what influenced decisions in this experience? Quality, money, or time? What are you seeing there?
Again, money's not the prime driver.
Yeah,
Definitely time versus
Yeah.
It's a good balance between time and quality.
Yeah.
There's a few that are just a balance entirely between money and time, which is
Right.
Yeah.
That makes
Yeah.
me sad.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, so we've got a few balanced there between time and money, but yeah, as you said, heavy dominance here of a balance between time and quality on influencing decisions. Okay, so let's look at so we'll look at some more of those in a moment, but let's look at what this means in terms of how we feel about working as part of this architecture. So one of the questions I asked is, what's the emotion associated with this experience? And the options were strongly positive, positive, neutral, negative, strongly negative. What are you seeing? Yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah.
a couple of people had a really good time.
Yeah, yeah. A couple of very strongly positive. Mostly positive, neutral, some negative, no strongly negative. Okay. So again, we're not judging this as good or bad, right or wrong, but that feels okay, right? We certainly want to look at some of the negative experiences and see what's causing that. But positive, neutral, yeah, good, okay. Now, one of the things that we want to do in managing in complex systems is look at the experiences like we did earlier this morning and see, well, for those experiences that we want to see more of, how do we amplify them? And for those experiences that we'd like to see less of in the organization related to our architecture, how do we dampen them or mitigate against them? So one indicator for that is the positive and negative sentiment associated with experiences. It's generally true, but not always true, that we'd like to amplify the positive experiences and dampen the negative experiences. Is that fair enough? Okay. So what we can do then is look at the positive ones and see, well, how do we generate more of these within the team, within the organization? And how do we get to those positive experiences? Well, you've been tracking your architecture and your experiences, so I could look at, SK, for example, or OD, and see, well, what are the experiences that are reflected in there? Okay. Let's look at or how common is this type of experience? Because if it's a positive experience that's not happening very often, that's also useful information. So the options here were happens all the time, happens sometimes, happens a lot, rarely, or never before or since. What are you seeing here as options or as patterns?
It's common.
Yeah. Yeah, it's common. So most of the experiences are pretty common or more frequent. Only one rare, only one never before or since. So whatever these experiences that we're having, they're happening a lot, to sometimes, to all of the time. So if we take, for example, LB, I think, or CB, and I'll look for those here. LB is here, so it's negative and it's happening all the time. So that's useful information, okay? So that's something that we'd want to look into and see, well, why is that happening all the time? Or what are some of the contributing factors to that type of experience? So these things have an effect on our architecture and how we work with it, and they're going to inform how we take action in a few minutes. Okay. Let's move on to this one. So architecture-related metrics in this experience were, so pretty strong pattern there. Generally too little architecture-related metrics or too few architecture-related metrics. And
as much helpful as unhelpful.
Yeah, yeah. So we've got a bunch that are helpful and a bunch that are not helpful. So it's an interesting mix. Okay. Again, if we were part of the same product team, we'd probably see a little more coherence there in the patterns. But even so, that's still useful information. It would be interesting to see what are the metrics that are giving us some useful feedback and guiding our decision making versus those that are not. It would also be interesting to see for those ones that are helpful, what can we do to get some more of them? Okay. Anything else you're taking away from that one? Okay. So let's take a look at architecture documentation in this experience. Again, the quadrant is ranging from unhelpful to helpful, too little to too much. So quite a strong statement there, quite a lot of consensus.
Overall, there's not enough and it's generally
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So great that what we have is helpful. So that is a positive thing. Again, without judging it as good or bad or anything, but it's generally a good thing. But we've got too little of it. So there is some investment we can make in creating more architecture documentation. Now, what we can do is, because we've captured some of this information, we can start to look at those experiences that were negative and happening all the time. Are they correlated with having too few metrics or too little documentation? So we can start to build up that sort of picture and decide, do we need to invest more in these different things? What roles were involved in the experience? Again, you can see pretty strongly there's a lot of architects, engineers, managers involved in these experiences. Some experiences where there are customers involved, some where there are product managers, program managers, not so many for Scrum Masters or product owners or other. Okay, so again, why is that important? Why is it useful to know what roles are involved in these experiences?
If you have those roles and they're not involved,
Yeah.
like, do you want them to be?
Yeah. Yeah, so exactly. Yeah.
Diversity of viewpoint.
Yeah, diversity of perspective, of viewpoint, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And you can start to see some trends as well. So, for example, you might see that all of our strongly positive experiences that happen a lot or that happen all the time typically involve architects, engineers, managers, and customers, right? So you start to see that customers are involved in our positive experiences, which is maybe an interesting thing, or something that we can build on. Or you can start to see that, well, for those experiences that are negative and happen a lot, they involve product managers and managers, but not architects. Yeah, so maybe there's a gap there that we need to fill. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so for this one, what was valued in the experience that you shared? The options were a continuum from working software to comprehensive documentation. So again, that correlates with what we're seeing over here. So, yeah. So documentation is not being valued as strongly as other things. And again, that may be a conscious decision. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but we can see that we are feeling like we could benefit from more of the helpful documentation that we have. Okay, so this is, again, this isn't anybody telling us this. This is our information. We're just revealing this to ourselves as a group. Let's look at this one. Which of these are important in the experience? And again, we could have added more things if we were a single team, a single organization. But from here, we can see that microservices are important to a lot of the people in the room. Automation is important, continuous delivery, DevOps. What's less common or less important in the room as a whole are things like serverless, TDD, and AI or deep learning or machine learning. Okay. Again, useful contextual information about our architecture. We see that we need to deal with microservices and DevOps and continuous delivery, and that informs some of the things we need to take action on. Architecture in this experience is fully planned up front, emerged during development. We've got some cases where it's leaning towards being fully planned up front. We've got some cases where it's leaning towards being fully emerged during development, and a lot of cases where it's somewhere in the middle. Okay, some architecture planned up front with some significant portion emerging as we go during development. Okay. Okay, what matters in this experience? Responding to change versus following a plan. And again, a reasonable spread there, but you can see that we've got quite a few cases where responding to change is the dominant pattern. No cases where just following, well, maybe one or two cases where it's leaning towards following a plan being more important as mattering in this experience, but quite a few cases where the dominant pattern is a balance. We have a plan, we do need to follow it, but we also need to have that adaptive capacity to be able to deal with change. Okay, so again, useful information because it means that we're not in a position where we can define everything up front. We know we need to be able to respond to change. We know change will happen. We know some of the things that will be affected by that change. Let's talk more about the role of the architect. So role of the architect, clearly defined and understood versus not clear. Well, we've got some cases where it's not clear. We've got probably a dominant pattern where it's reasonably clearly defined and understood. Okay. So there may be some cases where we need to invest in making the role of the architect more clear, more widely understood, but mostly we're doing okay with that. Again, what we would want to do is look at cases where the role of the architect is not that clearly defined or understood, and correlate that with some of the other factors. Like, are we making the right decisions in relation to cost and quality and maintainability and serviceability and those sorts of things. The level of abstraction of the work of architects, ranging from very high level and abstract to writing production code daily. You can see that dominant pattern is somewhere in the middle. We've kind of got two clusters, sort of. We've got a cluster there where it's leaning towards being high level and abstract, but still writing some production code. And over here where it's leaning towards writing production code more often, but still some element of high level design, abstract design, that sort of thing. Okay. And let's take a look at this one. Deployment of the products or features. What do you see here on this one? Yeah, there's a big gap in the middle, yeah.
It's the only bimodal one.
It's one more time?
It's the only bimodal distribution.
Yeah, it's probably got the widest spread of the ones we've looked at so far, yeah. So we've got a very strong pattern over here around automation. You know, a few cases where we're veering towards fully automated, but a strong pattern of quite a strong amount of automation in the system. Over here, we've got a few cases where we've got very little automation. So, yeah, again, that's not good or bad or right or wrong. It's just, you know, we can ask ourselves, do we need more automation in these cases? Okay. But if we take automation to be a useful thing, then we've got a lot of cases where we've got a significant degree of automation, and maybe investing more or amplifying more of our automation investment would be a helpful thing. That's something that we'd decide on together. Okay, and we've got one more question on the wall over here. Sorry, coming through. So, in hindsight, what would you change about your architecture, ranging from nothing to everything? What do you see?
Looks like one person attained perfection.
Yeah, right here, yeah. Yeah, so nothing at all to change, okay, which is probably unusual, so.
It's quite a spread.
It is quite a spread, yeah.
That raises a question in my mind in looking at the architecture.
Yeah.
In many cases, like even the dot, I know where the dot is there.
Yeah.
It's not that I would change everything about the architecture. I would have subtle changes within the architecture.
Right.
In every aspect.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so you're probably somewhere in this region, I'd imagine, over the side. Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So further towards this side. Okay, good. Yeah. Okay, other observations? Okay, so let's see. So just very quickly, can you take your artifacts from earlier and stick them on the wall, please? Okay, so I'm going to just randomly pick one or two examples. I don't know, somebody give me a topic that they're interested in from the ones that we discussed. Could be documentation, could be the role of the architect, could be... Who achieved perfection? Okay, right. Okay, so you'll have to help me here. Is that AS?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so AS. Where is your poster, AS?
For the record, that was a little tongue in cheek.
Okay, that's okay. Let's pretend it's not. Okay. Okay. So.
Mine's right here.
Okay. Cool.
It keeps falling down. Yes. Which is up.
Okay. So AS. That's good. Great. Excellent. Thank you. Whoop. Okay. So you had the clock metaphor. Okay. Okay, so the story you chose to, or the experience you chose to relate to your friend was this architecture uses a Blackboard type platform to allow choreographed, distributed transactions and to provide state-of-the-art NLP capabilities. Yeah, cool, okay. And we've got a very descriptive architecture sketch there. So we can, because we know your green sticker is AS, we can look around and see, well, in terms of architecture documentation, you can probably help me find this quicker. Yeah, you may as well, please. Thank you.
I think I remember where I put it and how I feel about this.
Yeah, great.
It was, I can't find it either. I might, oh, here it is.
There, okay, great, okay.
It's upside down, that's why.
Cool, okay, so helpful, veering towards too much documentation almost, but a good amount of documentation.
The middle being neutral, so a good amount as well.
Yeah, good, a good amount of documentation, great, okay. And in terms of metrics, do you remember where you were on this one?
Here.
Yeah, right there, great. Okay, so unhelpful, too little, too few metrics. And experience, do you remember?
Strongly positive.
Strongly positive experience. And in terms of frequency?
Never before or since.
Okay, so this is a once-off experience that's strongly positive. One of the fewer cases where we've got a good amount of documentation. We could look around at some of the other attributes to see how you stand there with things like role of the architect, those sorts of things. But you get the idea. We can start to trace through, either starting with some of the data here and tracing back to the experience, or starting with the experience and tracing through the responses. We can start to build up a picture of how this relates for you. Let's take one other topic or volunteer. Okay, or just a topic. So something that you're interested in from what we described.
I'm curious about the negative and happens all the time one.
Negative and happens all the time. Yeah. I think was it ORB? Was that right? That looks like ORB. Who's ORB? Maybe I'm reading this wrong. It could be a K8, yeah. Okay, excellent. It's a K8, excellent.
It already fell off. So.
Cool, okay. Yeah. Do you want to tell us about yours?
I mapped out our testing system, which is what my purview is.
Yeah.
So the negative is that it is a vast system that creates a lot of noise. Not many people are paying attention because of all the noise.
Okay.
So.
And this is happening all the time?
Yep, every day, 6 times a day.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's more than 6 times, but the big ones run 6 times a day.
Okay. And in terms of, let's see, what roles are involved in your experience? Do you recall?
It was architects, engineers,
yeah,
and some management.
Managers, yeah, okay. So in terms of affecting any sort of change there, those are probably the groups that we need to talk with and engage with. Okay, let's look at this one. What influenced decisions in this experience? Quality, money, time.
Where did I go? Oh, I totally forgot.
That's okay. Where would you go right now?
It would probably be based on the time,
Yeah.
because getting good quality out of
Yeah,
a lot of test results that don't necessarily, aren't necessarily evaluated.
yeah. And let's see, maintainability, extensibility, stability.
Oh, I'm right in the middle.
Okay, cool. So a balance of all three pretty much.
Yes.
Okay, great. And so we could go on and look at more of these. But again, what we're doing is just building up a picture of what are some of the important factors in the experience that you've described. Okay, and again, we can approach it from both directions. We can start with the patterns and work back to the experiences. So exactly as you suggested, what's the I think what negative experience that happens all the time was what you called out. Yeah, so those are some of the things, if we're looking at how to make improvements with our architecture and with our organization around our architecture, then paying attention to some of the negative experiences that happen all the time and turning those around is absolutely an important strategy. And we look at other experiences that are negative and happen all the time and see what are some of the factors we could address there. Okay, thank you. Okay. So, just in. So let's see. So we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. I just want to start to wrap it up. Now, in a longer workshop, I would go into something like experiment design to start to pick some topics to make some changes around. And we'd talk more about things like culture and organization and complex systems and experiments. For now, I want to leave you with the idea that you can extract patterns from the information that you generate here, and that you can build up a picture of what's happening within your systems by examining those patterns. And that gives you some information for deciding what action to make. Remember our premise at the very beginning, we're trying to make sense of our architectures to decide what actions to take. So we all came into this together without any kind of preconceived ideas about what changes would be important for this architecture, again, pretending that we're all part of the same team. What we've done together then is build up a picture of some of the things that are happening within our architecture and within our organization that are influencing our architectures. And that's now given us some information on which to base some decisions around things that we want to change. So maybe we want to see more documentation, maybe we want to see more focus on architects understanding the revenue model of the organization, maybe we want to see some more focus on trying out serverless as an option for our architecture, those sorts of things. But we've got some information now that's pointing us towards those options, and we can make some decisions around what to invest in. What I will do is I'll take some pictures of all of these and figure out a way to make them available through the SATURN website. I'll upload the slides as well. So if you're interested, feel free to take your own pictures if you want to, but I'll collate them and pick up the ones that are falling and make some sense out of them and share them with you all. Feel free to ping me an email or a DM on Twitter or something if you'd like to get a copy of that. If you don't see me uploading them fast enough, I'm happy to share all of this stuff. But before we finish up, what questions do you have about any of this? Yeah, so 1 and then 2, yeah.
In practicum,
yeah.
I would imagine this applies across the board, either through the customer, or it could be on a team basis or on an individual basis. What have you seen as most effective?
So the question is that you imagine, and rightly so, that this applies across the board on an organization basis, architecture, customer, team. So yes, I've used this in all of those contexts and others. Sorry, so be warned if you're attaching posters to these walls. So is your question, what are some good practices for making this more effective, or is the question more about which context is more useful?
If you were to prioritize which one you would start with, what would be the first?
So prioritizing which of those contexts to start with. So I'm going to give you the horrible "it depends" answer, and I apologize because it really does. I've used this in all of those contexts. Really the priority is driven by, you'll know by your own organization, are you fighting fires with your architecture? If so, start with the architecture. Does your team have some trouble figuring out some aspect of why your architecture is complex? Then start with your architecture. But if you know already it's not just the architecture, that maybe there's some other pain points in the organization, then start with the team as a focus. If you've got challenges with customers, start with your customers. There's no reason why you can't do all these in roughly parallel sequence, like over the course of a couple of days or a couple of weeks, cover all of those, and you get a whole lot of different perspectives. So that's very useful. But there's no one right way to start. It really depends what your particular immediate challenges are. Does that help? Great. And you had a question?
Is there anything you would change in particular
Is there anything I would change for a distributed team? So there are some software solutions that make this doable with distributed teams, so that you're not just using pen and paper. So I look at those sorts of things.
I was thinking more about things like engagement.
In terms of engagement?
Yes. It could become impersonal if you have a distributed team doing these things.
Right. Well, I guess no. So I guess not specific to this activity, but I suppose common across any sort of activity where you've got a distributed team and you're trying to encourage engagement. So a lot of the teams I work with are split across, or a lot of the organizations rather that I work with are split across multiple continents, multiple countries. So what I'll generally do is, if we're not doing this in one room altogether, if we're doing it in a distributed setting, I'll have facilitators in each of the locations as one thing. Rather than have everybody kind of try to tune into one central location, I'll split it off as a series of parallel activities and make the individual sites focuses of activity, and then we'll have feed-in sessions for collating all of the information, that sort of thing. But that's not specific to this activity, really. So is that helpful? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. If you want to talk more about that, you'll feel free to catch me after. Okay, sure. Okay, I think, I'm sorry, yeah. Oh, yeah. You go. Oh, we're out of time. Okay. Thank you.